Marx is going to characterize the aspects of alienation and estrangement in four different dimensions. One with respect to the object, the product. One with respect to the activity of laboring. And what are the two other aspects that he's going to speak about alienation and estrangement?
Alienation from himself and from other
Well,
people.
what about himself? I mean,
As a
some, not just
species
alienation from one species being, and what else?
Other people.
Yeah, the alienation of individuals from one another. Now, the alienation and estrangement of the individual from the product takes a multiple form. As Marx points out, if we're thinking about any kind of productive activity, and this is in the sense of any technical activity or any activity that's connected to the natural metabolism of the human being as a biological entity that has needs that have to be satisfied by interacting with stuff outside you. Well, on the one hand, you need nature as an object to work upon, and you also need nature as that which is going to satisfy your needs and allow you to survive. Now here, in a certain respect, Marx claims the individual loses that immediate access or connection or disposal over nature, and in a sense over what will satisfy one's needs. Instead, the product, in not belonging to the individual, signifies that the individual, in a sense, also does not have at hand any direct accessibility to what is needed in order to produce the product. In other words, not only does the product not belong to the individual, but what else does not belong?
The inputs.
Yeah, and how might one speak of them generally? What kind of inputs, generally speaking, are we talking
Raw
about?
materials.
Raw materials, what else?
Capital.
Any kind of tools. Now, by the way, when we talk about capital, we want to look at that later, what it involves, because capital can but need not involve. Raw materials can take the form of capital. Instruments of production can take the form of capital, not just materials. And purchased labor power can take the form of capital in various ways. But we'll discuss this later. We'll have more means to do so when we look at capital. But anyway, here we're in a situation where, in effect, tied up with the alienation of the product from the laborer is that the very conditions of production are also confronting the labor as a foreign power. And the implication also is that these aspects of production are themselves products of laboring. Now you might ask, well, can that be true of raw materials? Can it be true of raw materials in any sense? That they are products of labor? Because Marx is implying here, as he will elsewhere, that in effect, we're here in an economic condition where what more and more figure as objects of labor are products. So that what we are relating to is not nature, but the product of productive activity. Well, raw materials, after all, are not just there at hand. First of all, even if they're lying there to be taken by a hunter-gatherer, they still have to be brought to where they're going to be worked upon. And they may have to be extracted. So there are all sorts of laboring or productive activity that could, in a sense, provide for these activities. The point is that in all these cases, we're dealing with a productive activity that operates upon all these factors as factors that are not its own. And that also applies to the product itself. So in this respect, the product confronts the individuals who exercise the activity as, in a sense, a world that has been produced on which the individual depends for their subsistence. And through their very own production, this world becomes more and more something confronting them under alien hands, under a power that is not under their power, but something that belongs to those who not only possess the labor, but also the conditions of its production. Now this then applies equally to well, as Marx says, this involves, as he puts it, a kind of enslavement to the object of labor, to what is produced, what in a sense is an objectification in some respects of his activity. Namely, you can't even gain access to the situation of engaging in any productive activity unless you, in a certain respect, confront the product of labor as something belonging to someone else. Because they're the ones who are going to offer you the conditions for working. You're not even getting a chance to engage in work otherwise. And then when it comes to obtaining the objects you need to survive, they likewise are going to be products of labor and products that don't belong to you. So in both respects, regarding the conditions of work that, in the first instance, nature provides, in the second instance, that which is going to be the object of your needy satisfaction, all of these things are going to take the form of, in a way, objectifications of labor that are not in the hands of the laborer, but in the hands of some power from which they are estranged, that is foreign to them. And in this respect, they face it as an alien power. Now, by the way, what does this presume about the relationship of individuals to nature? What do they not have, which one could imagine oneself to have, under other historical circumstances, perhaps?
Natural right or entitlement?
Well, I mean, look, you might say you have a right or entitlement to, I don't know, what are you referring to
Land.
to take advantage?
Maybe
Yeah.
land, and that you could exploit the land for natural resources.
Or maybe there are no rights in question, but it's there, it's available. But in order for it not to be available, what has to be true about, shall we say, nature? It's become, minimally speaking, something in the form of property. It's now owned, and owned by particular individuals or corporations or governments or whatever. But that means that in order to have access to it, you have to either violate property relations, of which you have no right to do, or in some respect engage in some kind of contractual relation or exchange of property. So in a sense, we're talking about a situation where, in effect, all accessible nature has been taken ownership of. And for that reason, individuals can no longer relate directly to nature in order to satisfy their needs. That can't take place. Now, we have the alienation with regard to the object of labor, the product of labor. We also have a similar relation pertaining to the activity of the individual. Because to the extent that labor, and as Marx here puts it, not just labor, but also in conjunction with labor, the worker himself, is a commodity, the laboring activity does not belong to the individual who performs it. Right? It belongs to the employer. It belongs to the employer. So, in a certain sense, labor is now external to the worker. It doesn't belong to the worker. And it's also external in another way. Marx points out the engagement in laboring is something instrumental. It's not something you do for its own sake. It's something you do instrumentally. For what reason?
Money?
Yeah.
Pay?
Well, to obtain what you need to survive, minimally speaking. Which you can't get unless you perform labor because you don't have direct access to the goods that can satisfy your needs. You can only gain access to what you need by offering up your labor, and here Marx puts it as if you're offering up yourself as a commodity to those who own the productive process and have taken ownership of your laboring. So the whole activity you engage in is under the will of someone else. In a sense, your activity becomes an alien activity. And furthermore, although Marx does not bring this in at this stage, not only is it something that, in a way, you do only for the sake of something else, but if we were to think about how this activity can further take on the form of industrial production, the activity becomes more and more simplified according to the needs of the kind of mechanical division of labor that takes place in an industrial labor process, which means that the activity that is yours becomes more and more reduced to a rote activity, an activity that is, in its very way, manner of behavior, is as devoid of subjectivity as an activity could be, which is why it can be taken over by a machine that is not a living individual or a conscious individual.